Apologies. So today's topic is about e-commerce, but obviously we're just not going to talk about e-commerce. I'll provide an overview on how to do proper caching. The reason why we have decided to address e-commerce at the end of April is because in our experience, many e-commerce websites test changes and apply those changes at the latest mid-August, because from September on until the end of the year, that is considered holiday season. And for e-commerce website, that's definitely the most important part of the year in terms of sales. And that's why we have decided to address e-commerce during this season. So before we get started here, we are hiring. We have a couple of open positions. I'm not gonna explain what those positions are about. You can just go and have a look at our careers page. Just for referral, I've been working for this company for more than 4 years now. And if you're interested in joining a young, dynamic, and very agile team, just feel free to visit the page and apply. Also, before we actually get started with proper content, I think it's fair for you to know who is speaking right now. So that's me. When I'm not hiking, for the record, the picture was taken during Easter in Italy. So I like hiking, and when I'm not hiking, I am the tech evangelist for Varnish software. As I said, I've been working for this company for 4 years, and I have a technical background. Before being a technical evangelist, I have been a pre-sales and software engineer, and this obviously puts me in the position to be caching a CDN software specialist. You can reach out to me on Twitter using my Twitter account for any questions. That's usually the quickest way to reach out to me. A couple of words about the company I work for. So the most asked question whenever I'm traveling to events, or actually that's a statement, is I didn't know Varnish Cash had a company behind it. And the answer to that statement, even if you don't really need an answer to a statement, is that yes, Varnish Software is the company behind Varnish Cash, and we have a few offices worldwide. I worked at the Oslo office. Now I'm working from Italy, from the only Italian partner we have, and we do develop Varnish Cash and Varnish software solutions. For today, it will be extremely focused on caching. And we're not going to address the CDN part of it. Even if you're a big e-commerce platform, you're most likely interested in CDN as well. But that's for another webinar or another presentation later on. So let's start talking about caching. Why is that important? I don't really think I need to explain you why caching is important, as it's now considered one of the best practice. But just to give you a few numbers, or quoting Henry Shum, a Microsoft engineer, if your website takes 250 milliseconds more than your competitor websites to load, most likely you're going to lose a customer or a user. Some more numbers. 1 second delay can lead to 11% less page views, less 16% of customer satisfaction, and less 7% online sales. In US dollars, it means that if you make about 85,000 USD per day, in 1 year, you can lose more than 2 million USD. So that's extremely clear why caching is key for web performance, and especially for e-commerce. So to build up some context, how does an e-commerce look like? That's one of our customers. I did a presentation about their use case, I think more than a year ago, should be online still, and the use case is on our website. That's a typical e-commerce. Obviously, when we talk about e-commerce website, it's basically about purchasing everything online, and nowadays you can buy everything really. But just to give you an idea of the regular e-commerce website, as you can see, this website is divided into fragments. We're going to address this later on in the presentation, and most likely they are ESI fragments, and each of those fragments can be cached. You can cache also the most private part of your website, and that's the logon. That's the logon part of your website. That's the private web pages. That's basically what the purchase happens. So you can really cache everything, and by the end of the presentation, I'm gonna show you how to do it with proper VCL and the features in place. So as I told you, today's topic is e-commerce, but really we're gonna talk about online shopping. So when we talk about e-commerce, the very first e-commerce website was developed around 1982, and that was the Boston Computer Exchange. It was a website which used to sell used laptops. That's the very first recorded e-commerce site. In the last, I will say, 4 or 5 years, many users have started adopting mobile. So many purchases happen via phone. Personally, I tend to buy clothes using a desktop, and I tend to buy tickets or any other experience. So we're talking about concerts, we're talking about trips, any other thing, using my phone. And what's important to note here is that when you use your phone, most likely you don't want to use a Wi-Fi connection, because you don't really want to deliver your credit card credential on a public Wi-Fi connection. So you're going to use a private mobile connection, which nowadays is still slightly slower than Wi-Fi and still more expensive than Wi-Fi or any other connection. And we're going to address this as well. While if you look in the near future, we have something completely new, which I have decided to call as or define as e-commerce. I'm not sure if that's the name used in the internet, but if it doesn't exist, we just found a name for the new way of selling on the internet, and that's the augmented reality online shopping. Like IKEA has been one of the first one to provide an application which allows you to take a picture of your room and try to position the couch you wanted to buy and see if it works with the color of your walls. So I know many e-commerce websites are currently working on it. From a technical point of view, caching will still be required, and I honestly believe the bottleneck will be network again, because obviously augmented reality requires more packets being shuffled on the same HTTP connection, and that's also the reason why the technology or companies are developing and pushing for 4K, 8K, and 16K definition, because that's strictly connected to augmented reality and virtual reality, and somehow this is going to touch online shopping as well. So for today, we're actually addressing e-commerce as a single platform. I mean, it's up to the web developer to develop different websites based on the desktop or a mobile version. But from a caching point of view, the e-commerce architecture you want to put in place can pretty much look like this. So if you're new to Varnish or caching in general, you really need to craft a new infrastructure, that's the one I will suggest to you. So we have users, and that's the laptop up there. On the bottom, we have our origin servers, web servers, or backends. And then we have a symmetrical architecture. As you can see, we always work in pairs. Those two pairs, one of the two can be passive. It can be, and it can be used as a simple backup, just in case something is wrong with the left branch. You can spin up the right branch. Doesn't necessarily mean you need to use both of them at the same time. Again, as you can see, we have a couple of Varnish instances in place, and those two instances are synchronized using VHA. That's Varnish high availability, and it's a little daemon that sits next to Varnish, and whenever a new object or a new piece of content is inserted in cache, it will automatically replicate it to the other node as well. This reduces strain on the backends, and obviously you have less backend connection, a higher hit rate, and overall better performance. Also, you definitely need to have encrypted connections, and that's because, first of all, you don't want your user to send his or her credit card credential on a plain connection, and also because in a month or so, GDPR, the Global Data Protection Regulation, will kick in, and you will have to handle your users' data properly, and you definitely want to avoid any breach of the regulation, and you don't want to leak any data. This has been addressed in another webinar, so if you want to dive into that, just go to our webinars page and have a look at the previous webinar. You're gonna find a lot of information in there. So that's really pretty much the whole architecture. We're definitely not going to. I'm not giving any more detail about this infrastructure. You can always reach out to me if you have a specific, if you have any specific question or really anything else, and we can address the problem. We can address the problem together. Also, like, you can decide to deploy your architecture either on bare metal or on cloud. So we have Varnish solution on premise, and we also have images on AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure. My personal suggestion will be, if you are going to develop a brand new website and you don't have any hardware in place, just make something cloud native, because it's going to be cost effective. It's easier to maintain because it's really not up to you. All you got to do is just develop the code you want to have in place and make sure everything is performing as expected. If you already have data center, or for any reason you want to have a data center, then you can rely on bare metal. Like, also a very good approach is to go for the hybrid approach. So using bare metal and a cloud solution together for the same website. So the idea is that if you use both of them, you can actually scale up and down quicker. The cloud can be used for unexpected traffic. That's a very good backup. And we're talking about, I don't know, I'll think about the royal dress whenever Meghan wears something new. A website in the world crashes because everyone is trying to buy that website, and that's sort of unexpected because you don't really know when when Meghan is going to wear a specific dress. So be ready for that unexpected traffic, and the best way to do so is obviously to rely on the cloud, because you don't really need to set up any server. You just have to spin up a Varnish instance in one of the cloud, and that will be it, really. Also, we tend not to talk about VCL, but for this webinar, VCL, or really for every use case, VCL, the Varnish configuration language, is a must. So if you want to be extremely performant, you gotta pay attention to each particular you have in your architecture. So the VCL stands for Varnish Configuration Language, and it's a small scripting language. It's very lightweighted, and it allows you to define your own caching logic. So if you do remember the slide where I was presenting how the regular e-commerce look like and where I've mentioned fragments, it means that with VCL you can define a specific caching policy for each of those fragments, even if they're part of the same web page. You can really tweak your website as much as you want, and that's extremely important, especially when it comes to user personalization. And you can run all of this at the very edge of your architecture. So you can offload the logic at the edge of your architecture and improve. I mean, obviously you're going to have less latency and you're going to improve the web performance overall. So now we have a sort of a good scenario of what an e-commerce is, a little bit of the challenges, and why caching is so important, and how and where to deploy it. And now we move on to the second part of the webinar, where we're going to talk about Edgestash, parallel ESI, and I'll share a few VCL tips. So the interesting bit about the VCL tips is that you can basically just screenshot your screen and you can use the VCL you see there, because it's gonna work. It's a good skeleton. It's a good starting point for your e-commerce website. So Edgestash. First of all, before I do introduce Edgestash, let's address the problem. Whenever a user / a browser makes a request to a web server, that request will obviously trigger a few round trips before it's fully fulfilled. And that's because the browser needs the templating, and the browser will request the JavaScript library, a JSON file, a few other images, and when it finally has everything in place, it will render the page to the user. So it obviously requires a few round trips and a little bit of bandwidth. So without Edgestash, a client will make a request for a page template. The server will reply back, and we get some content on our browser. And then the client notices it will need a JavaScript library and will make another request. The server replies back. But the JavaScript library makes no sense if we don't have a JSON file in place. So the client will have to trigger another request for some JSON data. The server will reply back, and eventually the browser will be able to render the content. And that's a real problem, especially if you're on a mobile connection, because more round trips means more latency, or more time to render the page, and obviously this leads to less sales, as previously said. But it also means more bandwidth consumed, and the network nowadays is still a problem. Like most of the time is the network itself the real bottleneck and the real performance issue. And we have been pondering about this, and we came up with Edgestash itself. So if you think about it, if you're caching, most likely Varnish has already in storage the page templating, the JavaScript library, the JSON file as well. So everything is already in cache. And the solution we found is that Varnish is capable to pre-render the page and just return a full response to the browser. So the client will simply send a request to the server asking for a specific page, and the server will reply back with a pre-rendered page. Like, as you can see, that's a single round trip. So we obviously consume less bandwidth. We have less round trip in place, and overall we do reduce bandwidth. That's again like a good way to show you how it works. The best way to implement this is that if you have multiple layers of Varnish caching, you will want to implement Edgestash at the edge of your architecture, like as close as possible to your as close as possible to your final user. So in terms of benefits, again, you will have less latency, better performance. When it comes to better performance, again, you're most likely going to see an increase on your sales, and this will open up to less bandwidth and less round trips, will open up to more user personalization, which is extremely important. And I'm sure I don't really need to explain you how user personalization and conversion works for e-commerce. But with more user personalization, this will be like extremely useful also if combined with parallel ESI and a few other VCL tips I'm going to show you later. So how does Edgestash work? Well, first of all, if you remember the example, like to render a page, we basically need a library, or we need Edgestash does understand a mustache syntax, so we need a library, and this library will need a JSON data with values, and we'll use those values to render the page. This VCL will work, so if you have to do a screenshot, do it now. Okay, I'm gonna go through it and try to explain it. So in VCL backend response, that's a subroutine which is run whenever a new piece of content is inserted in cache. So when we insert a new object in cache, we're going to check if the backend request URL matches a JSON file. We're going to index a JSON file. And that's important because we want it to be a proper JSON file. We want it to be in place because this JSON file and the values within this JSON file will then be used to pre-render the page. Otherwise, if the backend request URL matches Edgestash, we just parse the response. Basically, at this point, we already have a pre-rendered page. Like everything is in place, everything has been parsed. We just need to pre-assemble everything, and then it will be done. The pre-assembling part will be done in VCL deliver, and this subroutine is run whenever Varnish starts replying back to the end user, to the client. So if the request URL is either Edgestash, and we actually check the response matches a mustache's syntax, we are going to execute Edgestash. So this execute here is the function in charge of taking the Edgestash the mustache templating and filling it with the JSON values. And that's it. You have pre-rendered a page, and all you gotta do is just Varnish will just reply back to the client, and the browser will finish the rendering, and that's it, and it's done. That's a vmode, and so it's a Varnish module, and that's an extension for Varnish. It's documented on our docs.varnishsoftware.com. There are more examples, just check it out because it's extremely interesting. So Edgestash has been covered. The next feature, parallel ESI. So to bring everyone on the same page, you might not know what ESI is. ESI stands for Edge Side Includes. It's a markup from 1999 developed by Oracle and Akamai together. It allows you to divide a single page in different fragments. As you can see in this example, we have a few fragments, and that's like a unique web page. And it's extremely useful because just to bring an example here, the trending box or the trending fragment, this one will most likely change every 5 minutes or so, no more than 10 minutes, definitely, because that represents what is trending on the internet at the moment. While the title, that might stay be the same for 3 hours in a row. If you use ESI, you can decide that the caching policy for the title is 3 hours. So after 3 hours, the title will be purged from cache and new content will be fetched from the backend. While the caching policy for the trending fragment might be 5 minutes. So the time to live of this fragment is 5 minutes. And it will be nuked from cache every 5 minutes, and fresh content will be fetched from the backend. Without ESI, if the trending part changes every 5 minutes, you will have to discard the whole page every 5 minutes and fetch the whole page every 5 minutes. And that obviously brings a performance issue in here and requires again more bandwidth and more round trips. It's really not optimal. So that's what ESI is. And it is an HTML markup, and it's really easy to read. In your HTML, you will just include the source of your ESI fragments and the one you want to use. So both Varnish Cache, the open source project, and Varnish Cache Plus or any other Varnish software solution supports ESI. But in the open source, if we have 4 ESI fragments in a single page, the browser will send a request, and Varnish will notice we have 4 ESI fragments, and it will trigger a backend request to fetch the first fragment. It will trigger another backend request to fetch the second fragment, a third backend request for the third fragment, and eventually the fourth backend request. Varnish will notice it managed to fetch each of the 4 fragments and send a response to the browser. While in Varnish Cache Plus, the client will send a request. Varnish will trigger 4 backend requests at the same time, and it will send a response to the end user. So obviously, there is really no need to tell you that the open source will execute each ESI fragments in a serial way, while the Varnish Cache Plus will do that in a parallel build. And again, you will have a performance boost in here. In terms of numbers, we have seen a 50% reduction on time to first byte, a performance boost like overall, because if you use a lot of ESI, you're definitely gonna notice this, especially if you have more than a single level of if you have more than 2 levels of ESI in place, and overall better mobile content delivery. Again, that's because bandwidth is still expensive and it is limited somehow. So how does it work? That's extremely beautiful. There is nothing you gotta do. That's the default behavior for Varnish Cache Plus. That's a feature which is not available for the open source. So if you really need it, I encourage you to reach out again, either to me or one of my colleagues. So far we have addressed Edgestash, pre-rendering content at the edge of your architecture, and parallel ESI to reduce the time to first byte and to improve performance in terms of response. And now we get into the VCL part, and I know you're extremely interested in this. I'm gonna share 3 VCL snippets. And if you think about an e-commerce, the very first step taken by a user at some point will be to authenticate him or herself. We assume you have a third-party service creating a single sign-on or an ID, which we're going to call a cookie. So you have a third party creating a cookie, and this cookie is assigned to the user. And the user will have to present this signature every time he or she tries to log on. So the user will send a request including a signature header, and using again a Varnish module called the digest vmod that's documented again on our website, we are going to run a verification on the signature and make sure that the user is indeed who she or he claims he or she is. And if everything is fine, well, in this case, we just set an authentication status header equal to OK. But based on the outcome of this digest HMAC chat 256, you can decide to either reject the user or to make him/her proceed to the private part of the website. You will have to run this VCL snippet at the very edge of your architecture. So if you have a multiple layer infrastructure in place, you obviously want to authenticate your user at the very top, at the very edge of your architecture, because it makes no sense to authenticate him or her like in other layers. You want to make sure that person is reliable and he or she is indeed a customer. So that's the very first step you can run. Obviously, this piece of VCL can be extended as much as you want. You can also, like starting from this piece of VCL, you can also use other vmods to send requests to your authentication server or your third-party authentication service and try to fetch a new cookie or create a new cookie header. It really opens up to a lot of possibilities, but unfortunately I don't have time to expand on this today because it easily gets quite difficult in here. Well, not difficult, but it's definitely more complex and it requires more time to run through the VCL. So now we have an authenticated user in place, and obviously this user will have at least a cookie header. Most likely it will have more cookies header. And like until last year, everyone used to suggest not to cache with cookies, and that's because cookie header usually brings personal information. The problem nowadays is that each website has at least a cookie header, and they use either for tracking or for bringing personal information in there. We used to, well, Varnish itself doesn't cache if there is a cookie header in place, and that's for safety reason, because we don't want to leak any personal data at all. But it doesn't necessarily mean you can't do it. You can cache with cookie in place. And most likely you're going to have either tracking cookies, and that's absolutely fine. It's not an issue at all, because for an e-commerce website, tracking a specific user, you just want to see what she or he is interested in, and you just follow the journey, really. So you're not leaking any private info. But when it comes to the cart part or to the logon page or the more private page, that's something you have to be a little bit more careful about, because that's where the information is really user private. So for the tracking cookies, in VCL receive, and that's when we receive the incoming request, we notice we have a request cookie, and we save this cookie in a header called cookie backup, and then we unset the original cookie header. And that's because we need to unset the original cookie header, because Varnish otherwise will, if Varnish notices there is a cookie header, it will bypass the cache and not cache the content, and that's not what we want. We still want to keep the cookie header, and we still want to cache content, because we know we can cache that specific piece of content. In VCL hash, the subroutine responsible for the cache lookup, we check if we have a cookie backup header, then we are going to restore the original cookie header. And we can do this because in this subroutine, the lookup is already happening and we're not bypassing the cache. If we end up in this subroutine, it means that Varnish is trying to cache or is trying to retrieve from cache a specific piece of content. So in this way, we're able to keep our cookie header and still cache content. While if we want to cache a cart on an e-commerce website, what we gotta do is in VCL hash again, we will have to check if we have a cookie header and if the request URL matches, for instance, the user cart. In that specific case, to our hashing scheme, we're going to add the cookie header. So by default, Varnish, when creating an hash key, Varnish will create an hash key for each new object inserted in cache. And this hash key will be generated using the request URL and the request host name. To those two parameters, if we're trying to cache a cart, we want to add a cookie header as well. Please do notice that there is an if here, and that's a condition. Like you need to have some sort of condition in place in VCL hash, because we don't want to use the cookie header for any arbitrary object within your e-commerce. If you cache every single fragment using the request URL, the host name, and the cookie header, that will lead to cache fragmentation. But if you do cache the cart fragment or the very specific or logon fragment, you can cache using the request URL, the host name, and the cookie header. That's a special use case, and you can do it. Just don't do it for every single fragment you have in place and for every single page you have, because that won't be optimal in terms of performance. Now, third VCL example, adding a secondary hash key. So as I told you, Varnish by default, we create a hash key for each new object inserted in cache. And that will be a unique hash key, obviously. And when you need to run some cache invalidation and you try to free up some memory, purging the cache, to purge the cache, obviously, you will have to nail the hash key for each object, because you will have to research the object in cache and purge it. To ease this up, you can add a secondary hash key to every object. So a secondary hash key really works like a tag. Just think about Instagram tags or blog post tags. So you do add a tag to each object, and with a single purge, you can delete every object matching that specific tag. Again, this piece of VCL, let's start with VCL backend response, because we first insert a new object in cache, and when we fetch a new object and we import it in cache from the backend, that's a moment when we try to add a secondary hash key. You can add one or more secondary hash key, as you can see here. And eventually, when a purge request kicks in or comes in, and that's usually run by a sysadmin or a web developer, we are going to check if we're able to purge content matching that specific X key purge sent within the purge itself. So that's extremely useful, especially for e-commerce, because like if I think about clothes, I'm quite sure you might have spring clothes or winter clothes, and obviously when the season changes, it's super easy to just delete every piece of content matching the season spring or matching the season winter, and you will have to run a single purge to do it. So to bring everything together and give some sense to what I've just been talking about, again, that's the usual e-commerce That's a usually e-commerce website. As you can see, we have a header, we have a logon fragment, a social footer, and a few images matched for the winter season, for example. Like, most likely this website is implementing using ESI fragments. Well, at least it really looks like those are ESI fragments, and you could also have used a Mustache templating and the Edgestash at the very edge of your architecture. Now, the user is going to log on, and as you can see, only this fragment has changed. Everything else just stayed the same. Like, I logged on, and you have noticed you send me some personalized content because you know I'm a woman, and you know my name, you can guess my age, and you have been tracking me because now I have a cookie header in place, and you do send me something personalized for me because you know I'm sitting in Italy and I don't want to buy winter clothes when outside is 23 degrees and you know it's spring, so that's perfectly fine. And so far for the authentication, we use the very first VCL snippets. For the personalization, we have used the cookie for tracking, and also we have used parallel ESI to render those three images faster altogether. And eventually a sysadmin notices that the season has changed and no one is going to buy winter clothes in spring. So a sysadmin will run a single purge using secondary hash keys, and he or she will try to purge every content matching the tag winter. So we run a purge, and then new content will be fetched from the backend, and now everything is in place. Now the website has just rendered personalized content for me and other spring content I might eventually like, or the usual standard spring content you render for every user. So in this example, we basically have used the authentication VCL, the cookie tracking VCL, the purging VCL, the parallel ESI, Edgestash, and all the other features I've been talking about. In terms of e-commerce, there is much more to be done, and like honestly, I will be happy to hear from you if you have any questions or any other input, or really any other thing, or also if you like to know more about the e-commerce specific use cases, because there is a lot of VCL we could write and we could ponder on together. So now it's time for a few questions. Those are my contacts. You can feel free to reach out to me using my email account or via Twitter, or just visit the Varnish software website if you have any question. Thank you very much. Bye bye. Cheers.